A very warm welcome to all our members across the world. I'm extremely pleased to see that we have attendees from over 25 countries registered for this event, mainly from the Americas and Europe, but also from as far afield as Mongolia. So welcome everyone. We have a full agenda today and tomorrow. So to get us started, I'm delighted to introduce you to the moderator of our first panel, Logan Finucane, who is a senior manager with one of our associate members, Access Partnership. Logan and his panel will be addressing the highly topical theme of online content regulation and how to preserve the internet as a forum for open discourse. Welcome, Logan.
Thank you very much, Lynn. And good morning to everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first panel of this year's Washington, D.C. Telecommunications and Media Forum. So as Lynn said, my name is Logan Finucane. I'm a senior manager on the policy innovation team at Access Partnership, which is a global consulting firm for technology public policy. So today, we will be exploring an issue near and dear to the hearts of many tech hands in Washington, D.C. Yes, we will be contributing to the already very robust conversation around Section 230. So whether you're someone who delights in talking about the finer points of Section 230 or are exhausted of having to explain how it works again and again, it's a hard topic to avoid these days. Despite the foundational role that the statute has played in how the internet has operated for 20 years, it does seem that across both parties and both chambers of Congress, a consensus of sorts has emerged. Speech on the internet is broken and Section 230 is the problem. However, while many agree that Section 230 is the mechanism we should focus on, consensus, of course, immediately falls apart when we try to define precisely what that problem is. This breaks down in well-worn partisan ways that everyone is well familiar with. So for Republicans, the issue is, censorious big tech, trying to moderate content in a biased way with impunity. For Democrats, it's that Section 230 allows big tech not to moderate content, allowing misinformation and hate speech to run rampant. So as techlash has grown in intensity over the last several years, there have been increasing issues that policymakers have laid at the feet of Section 230. Online harassment, child exploitation, harmful content, activities that people merely find distasteful or illegal, the list goes on. Anyone who's ever logged onto the internet will acknowledge that there are problems with how speech works online. But is Section 230 really the problem that we should be focusing on? Do we need to amend or revise Section 230 in any way in order to accomplish the ways that we think the environment for speech should be improved? Can amending Section 230 be part of the solution? If Congress is determined to hang big tech regulation on the hook of this small statute, is there some smart way we can go about tweaking it that won't break the internet? So I cannot promise that we will answer all of these questions and those that you, the audience, bring to us. Please, everyone, don't be shy about submitting questions. However, I look forward to exploring them and maybe breaking some new ground. So I'm very glad to be joined by several panelists that I believe can do just that. So before we dive into our main discussion, I'd like to ask each of them just to take a minute to introduce themselves. Let's start with Kate Tamarello, who is Executive Director at Engine.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Logan. So yes, I'm the Executive Director of Engine. Engine is a DC-based nonprofit that works with thousands of startups across the country to advocate for pro-startup, pro-innovation, pro-entrepreneurship policies. And I think one of the interesting things that Engine brings to this debate is kind of the perspective that this isn't all just about big tech. That's what you hear a lot in DC. There's a lot of frustrations at a handful of companies, but Section 230 is much bigger than that. And we've done some research into, for instance, the cost of litigation absent Section 230 and compared that to the average resources of a startup. And it shouldn't be shocking that without Section 230, a startup could be entirely wiped out. Its bankrolls could be entirely wiped out by one lawsuit over user-generated content. And then when you compare that with kind of the resources and time and energy that startups put into content moderation, I think it paints a really compelling picture that content moderation is incredibly difficult. It's inherently imperfect, and absent an intermediary liability framework like Section 230, you risk stuff like any reason for startups to host content to begin with. So really appreciate being here today. Thank you so much for having me, and excited to jump into it.
Thanks, Kate. So following representative of some of the smallest players who rely on Section 230, we also have Kate Sheridan, Intellectual Property and Content Regulation Public Policy Lead at Google. Hi, Kate.
Hey, Logan. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. As Logan said, I'm Kate Sheridan. I lead Google's public policy work on US content regulation and Section 230. Over my 11 years at the company, I've seen the best parts of the internet firsthand, the tremendous amount of opportunity, creativity, and entrepreneurship created by this increased access to information and freedom of expression online. But I've also learned a lot about the risks and the challenges that come with the openness. At Google, we take our responsibility to keep our users safe and to promote a more trustworthy internet seriously. And we've developed robust rules, procedures, and community guidelines that govern what activity is permissible on our platforms and update them regularly to meet the challenging needs of both our users and society. We invest significant resources in this space and have over 20,000 people working on these issues around the world. We believe that public policy has an important role to play here in ensuring that we're able to protect what is great about the open web, but also addressing harm and improving accountability. Recently, as Logan said, much of the discussion in the US has been focused on Section 230 and the incentive companies have to act responsibly. Our ability to provide access to a wide range of information and viewpoints while also being able to remove harmful content is made possible because of legal frameworks like Section 230. But as Kate said, it's not just us. Section 230 allows platforms and websites, big and small, across the entire internet to both responsibly manage content and promote access to information. As a recent letter by over 70 human rights and social justice groups stated clearly, Section 230 is a foundational law for expression and human rights when it comes to digital speech. The danger posed by uncareful changes to Section 230 is not theoretical. So when considering changes to Section 230, we should consider whether the change will effectively solve the root problem and carefully examine the potential risks of such a change to the entire ecosystem. We should also start to focus on more ways that companies can build more transparent, fair, and effective systems and processes. With this in mind, we believe there's more work to be done to bring industry, civil society, governments, and other stakeholders together to better understand the challenges we face and examine the potential solutions. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today, and thank you so much for having me.
That'd be fun. Thanks very much, Kate. Next, we are joined by Danielle Davis, Tech and Telecom Policy Counsel at the Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council.
Thank you, Logan. My name is Danielle Davis, and like Logan just said, I am the Tech and Telecom Policy Counsel for the Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council, more commonly known as MMTC, here in Washington, D.C. We are one of the nation's leading nonprofit organizations dedicated to preserving equal opportunity for people of color and women in mass media, telecommunications, and the technology industries. Section 230 of the CDA, sometimes referred to as the Internet's first law, is one of the most valuable tools for protecting freedom of expression and innovation on the internet. Section 230 was created to give online companies the ability to moderate user-generated content without being held liable for what they do or do not remove from their websites. However, with the evolution of the internet from AOL chat rooms to now large social media companies that host billions of users, Section 230 can often be times a double-edged sword. For instance, Section 230 facilitates the civil rights community's ability to speak to and organize mass audiences and to use the ballot box to express our electoral choice, which are all beneficial to traditional marginalized groups like the Black community. But even considering the pros, we cannot ignore the real world dangers to these same communities that also result from Section 230, such as disinformation, discrimination, hate speech, voter suppression efforts, which also impact the Black community in ways that not only threaten their civil rights, but their physical safety. Section 230 and algorithmic amplification speaks to a larger issue, though, the need for comprehensive legislation. Section 230 issues will not be fixed through a piecemeal patchwork of legislation. We need a comprehensive approach to the issues we are currently facing online. However, I urge policymakers to be careful, intentional, and considerate when legislating policy prescriptions for the issues Section 230 presents. It is imperative that policymakers understand the exact dangers they are trying to prevent and also ensure that they are accurately defining and describing these harms within the legislation. Too broad or too narrow definitions could lead to additional unnecessary debates surrounding technical definitions instead of defining the actual conduct that should be deemed unacceptable on these platforms. Thank you, and I look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you, Danielle. Finally, we have David Sullivan, Executive Director at the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership.
Thank you, Logan, and thanks to the IIC. I'm really looking forward to this conversation as well. So I'm the Executive Director of the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership. We're a unique new industry initiative to develop best practices for trust and safety of digital products and services. So our membership includes 11 companies, including Google and Microsoft, but also smaller players like Reddit and Patreon. And we launched in February of this year, setting out a framework of 5 overarching commitments for trust and safety excellence by the providers of digital services, which is supported by an inventory of about 35 best practices that companies of very different sizes and business models can use to create a safe and trustworthy online experience. Our aim is really to elevate this discipline, trust and safety. It's really the industry term for the teams that are dedicated to making our online experience safe and trustworthy. And we want to do this by building a process of independent assessment of these kinds of commitments and practices. So this conversation is very timely for us because just yesterday, we took a substantial step forward on this kind of journey towards independent assessment of company practices by releasing the methodology, which we call the SAFE framework, for how we are going to do these kinds of assessments and examine how companies are employing trust and safety practices. So we've tried to create a process that is rigorous enough to ensure that there is really substantial scrutiny of what companies are doing in this space, but is also flexible enough to cover a wide array of companies, products and services, and to be able to ensure that, you know, we're not just thinking about the tech, you know, leaders of today, but also startups that could grow into the tech leaders of tomorrow. So we're really taking a risk-based approach to this issue, and we're thinking about different levels of assessment and scrutiny of companies' trust and safety practices, depending not just only on the size of the company, but also on its impact on the digital environment, both in terms of the number of users of a given product or service, but also, you know, whether there are product features that that may introduce risk of the kinds that some of the other speakers have already mentioned. So I'll have more to say about this as we get into the discussion, but I'll just close by saying that DTSP, our mission is not about legislative advocacy. We really want to build these best practices in a public and transparent manner, and to introduce a level of accountability into this field and elevate this discipline. But at the same time, I will say that the practices that our companies are using for trust and safety rely on the legal certainty provided by Section 230.
Thanks so much, David. Well, let's jump right into our discussion. I'll just remind our audience again, have a look at the Q&A button at the bottom, submit questions that we will hopefully get to at the end of our discussion. But let's start first with perhaps one of the biggest questions or at least arguments that comes up in the Section 230 debate, at least in Congress. So Section 230's detractors like to argue that it was adopted to foster the growth of the nascent internet industry, but now that big tech is big, they don't need it anymore. Maybe Kate Sheeran, looking to you, what are your thoughts and what does Google say? Does Google still need Section 230?
So I think Section 230 is and still remains foundational to internet services and the open web. And you've heard from all of us today about how important Section 230 can be for both keeping consumers and people safe online, but also promoting access to information. But I think looking beyond just tech companies and platforms, Section 230 also is about consumers and communities and businesses of all kinds who interact online. Because of Section 230, they're benefiting from the access to information and the digital economy, the strong digital economy. And people have more access to opportunities to create content, to have a voice online, to start a business, and that is a good thing. Unfortunately, when we talk about changes to Section 230, we're not always considering the consequences for this broader ecosystem. And so I agree with the other panelists who've kind of mentioned in their opening that we have to just think very carefully about what those potential unintended consequences and risks are from the changes as we evaluate individual proposals.
Yeah, I would also, would I be able to add something? I would also like to add, I agree with everything that Kate just said, but we also have to keep in mind that just Section 230 gives immunity to these companies, but it also gives us something too. Like it also, like I said in my remarks, it gives us the ability, civil rights community, specifically the Black community, the ability to be heard. A lot of the times our voices are suppressed outside of these platforms. And when we have a situation where we have a Facebook where we have the ability to organize mass audiences to get our messages heard, things like Trayvon Martin would not have happened without social media. Things like George Floyd would not have taken off the way it happened without social media. So at the end of the day, and Section 230 governs all of this. So at the end of the day, we have to think about that it's not just solely that the companies are getting something and they're just benefiting. It plays a big part in our daily lives as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe turning to Kate Tamarello. So, Kate Sheridan just referenced the need to be mindful of the consequences for the wider ecosystem. Section 230 debates at the political level, are often just a proxy discussion for talking about big tech and problems that policymakers see with it. But you pointed out, of course, that Section 230 also protects a lot of smaller companies who enable online speech. So whether it's through changing Section 230 somehow or going some other route to address online speech, I'd like to hear more on your thoughts of how policy can strike a balance that can address some of those challenges with online speech without unduly burdening this sort of flourishing ecosystem that enables speech online as we know it today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you mentioned this obviously, and I mentioned earlier, but a really important thing here is that this isn't just about the biggest social media companies. It's also not just about social media, right? Online content isn't just like comments under a news article. It's photos, it's reviews, it's all things that you interact with every day when you use the internet that you probably don't appreciate because it kind of works so well. And that's all because of Section 230 operating in the background. So it's really important that when we think about changing 230, we're not just talking about not just big companies, but also not just social media companies. I think it's a much bigger ecosystem than that. And just to quickly add on to what Kate was saying before, I really think anyone thinking about Section 230 changes should try to moderate content for a day. To create a Facebook group with 10,000 users, which is a fraction of even the smallest company's user base, and just see what happens. Just see how easy it is or difficult it is to create clear rules and enforce them consistently and have to defend yourself constantly. Very famously, the New York Times had to shut down their cooking Facebook group because it got so off the rails. And that is a relatively narrow issue that should be relatively easy to contain. And so I think it's just a really important, even large companies, right, have a large amount of content. You would need like a 1-to-1 ratio to be able to consistently and perfectly enforce rules, if you could even agree on rules to begin with. And so even for startups, it's impossible as they scale. So I really encourage that as folks are thinking about amending frameworks like 230, just being really conscious of the fact that there's no perfect solution here. If we are changing the goalposts to get to an internet where only the good stuff stays up and only the bad stuff comes down and everybody is happy, we're tilting at windmills and we're never going to get there. So we need to be realistic and concise about the kinds of harms that Danielle talked about. And are there other ways to address those harms that don't end up suppressing speech online? So for instance, like privacy. I know you were talking about privacy later today. Privacy is a great way to get at some of the issues that Danielle mentioned. If we're concerned about targeting specific communities, there's ways to prohibit data uses that do that without, inadvertently silencing their speech as well. So that was a lot. Happy to delve into more detail.
Yeah, that certainly is a lot, and I'm sure we could have another panel on privacy alone. Yeah, I mean, curious if anyone else wants to jump in on what some of those sort of non-230 ways to get at some of these harms might be. I'm sure that's something that'll emerge as we continue to talk. But that does set up very well, what David is working on. So a lot of these discussions of moderating content online, as you referenced, Kate, are about, at least at the political level, about whether you take it down or leave it up. But that misses a lot of the ways that content actually moves online and the way that people use these tools to express themselves. So, David, you mentioned, the sort of broad suite of trust and safety tools that are out there, to be deployed within the context of a sort of risk management based approach, which is, I think, a different way of thinking about it than a lot of policymakers sometimes have in their head, especially when we're talking about Section 230, which can be very binary, right? It's whether you can be sued or whether you cannot be sued. So could you talk a little bit more about what some of those tools are that allow companies to moderate content in different ways? And what things are we not talking about in the 230 discussion these days that we should be?
Thanks, Logan. I think there's two dimensions to this question that I would sort of respond with. The first is that I agree, when we talk about content moderation, that sort of immediately makes one think of a content moderator making a decision about whether to keep up or leave down a particular piece of content. And I think one of the reasons why we're looking at sort of this broader suite of trust and safety commitments and operations and practices is because there's so much more than that. So our approach is sort of looking at these 5 commitments around product development, the governance of a product. So what are the rules and services, the rules that a service operates, enforcement of those rules, improvement over time, and transparency, whether that's with the public or with individual users or with regulators, about how all of this works. And I think if you zoom out a little bit and look at all of those dimensions, you can have a much more informed and purposeful discussion about how can you improve the quality of these experiences. The other thing I would say is I do think that in recent months, the political conversation about what to do about these issues has evolved to away from just focusing on sort of specific pieces of content to the question about how automated systems are ranking or recommending pieces of content, and that there's significant concerns about that. But I think you also can think about sort of what are the ways that one can examine through sort of the kind of best practices regime that we've developed, how algorithmically driven content is being addressed, as well as how those kinds of tools can be used in order to enforce rules and try to stop some of the harms that Danielle and others have mentioned already. Yeah,
maybe Danielle, turning back to you. So, you referenced how Section 230 is really powerful for protecting and enabling user speech, right? Which brings all sorts of benefits. So, arguments both in favor of and opposing changes to Section 230 talk about what is needed to maximize free speech online and the ability of people to express themselves online. And arguments either in favor of leaving Section 230 alone, are framed around that. Arguments in favor of why we need to change Section 230 is also are often talked about in those terms. So I think what it is sometimes missing is a frank discussion around who actually can exercise free speech online these days. So under the status quo, who sort of has the full access to it and who still faces barriers. So could you maybe talk a bit about that? Who does get to speak online these days? Who doesn't? And is there a role for regulation and maybe tinkering with Section 230 to address some of those problems?
Yes, okay, thank you for that, Logan. So whose speech is really censored? Before I can even answer that question, it's important to note that just like my other panelists have already kind of said in some shape or form, that social media regulation, the scope of online speech, and how First Amendment principles play into that is extremely complex. Like, it's an extremely complex area of law. And because of this, content moderation policies have a powerful impact on the conversations that we have online. So we have, like you have mentioned earlier, people on both ends of the political spectrum complain about bias by tech companies and content moderation. So we have conservatives arguing, conservative bias, and that, these companies are handpicking what and will not be shown, and that they're favoring Democrat content or whatever. And I'm not going to get into the merits of any of that, because arguments can be made on both sides. We could just say that. But if we're going to have a frank discussion about the status of online speech, numerous studies have found that content moderation policies disproportionately marginalize the voices of the Black community and other marginalized groups. So current content moderation, artificial intelligence is not as sophisticated as we would like to think, especially when it's moderating the speech of African-American vernacular, for example. It's not going to be as correct or accurate as it would just moderating regular English. So this is primarily because the natural language processing can amplify these biases like any other AI, and that results in Black speech being more heavily criticized. So we have one example where one study found that Black people were 1.5 times more likely to be flagged for their posts if it was written in African-American vernacular. So we also have a real world example of this. This isn't just like a study. We could talk about, I'm not going to do the whole long story, but the Black man and his white neighbor who essentially got into a dispute at their home. The white man called the Black man a racial epithet. It was caught on camera. It made the news. The Black man decided to make his own content on 2 different platforms, just describing his interpretation of what happened. Both of those posts were taken down. Why? We can't really assess that right now because they're not up. But at the same time, it's probably because of these content policies that are facially neutral, but they have a not so neutral impact on Black Americans. So we just have to think about, just to round out my answer, Black people and already other marginalized groups have serious obstacles towards ensuring that their voices are heard online. And it's primarily due to these content moderation policies and also the AI that also does content moderation. And it does not have a neutral effect for non-white users, to be honest.
Yeah, that gets at an important issue that we see Congress starting to focus on, especially these days. So a lot of the bills that have been introduced recently and where discussions seem to be going is focusing on the operation of algorithms in enabling or otherwise amplifying speech on online platforms. So, the House Energy and Commerce Committee last week had a hearing on a slew of these bills, the Protecting Americans from Dangerous Algorithms, Justice Against Malicious Algorithms, Civil Rights Modernization Act, et cetera, which all take some approach of trying to tweak Section 230 as it pertains to the use of algorithms to moderate content online. So it's not quite clear whether that is ultimately where this debate is going to end up, or whether there's bipartisan support for something like that. But it certainly seems to be the sort of trend of the moment. I'm curious for thoughts, maybe start with Danielle, but I'm curious for David or both Kates. Do you think that approach has merit? you know, it's in some ways a narrower way of tweaking Section 230 than some other approaches we've seen, but it can certainly have some knock-on effects that we may not be anticipating. What are your thoughts on that?
David mentioned something earlier, and I have to agree with it. Like, just honestly, I like the fact that policymakers are starting to become a little bit more sophisticated in this area, because like he said, it was very much so. Why did this come up in my Gmail account? Why didn't they take this down? Why didn't they keep that up? So I'm just liking the fact that we're talking about algorithmic amplification here, but I've had the chance to watch the House of Energy Commerce hearing, and I've also had a chance to review the bills. And I would say this, the bills have promising concepts. Like, I like the concept of trying to legislate against an actual harm. That's going to be like a theme throughout what I talk about today, but I must be honest, there are some real concerns about the language selection in the bills, because in I guess in theory, we all want liability for, I guess, for the things that they do, but I just don't think that these bills are fully capturing the correct terms to describe what they want to prevent. Like, okay, so like, let's take the Justice Against Malicious Algorithms Act, for example. It withdraws immunity from a platform that should have known that it was making a personalized recommendation. So, okay, so what does that mean? According to the actual bill, it's information specific to an individual. Information specific to an individual. So that's just basically saying that specific to the individual, it'll enhance the importance over other material. So my question is, what are you saying? Like, what is the issue with the recommendation, the personalized recommendation? Because that can be open for so many different areas of interpretation. Because I look at that little piece of the legislation to say that it seems that any platform that does not show everyone the exact same thing would lose Section 230 immunity. Like, is that how we're reading it? Or like, what does that, and then also, just like I said, this really bothers me just because of the personalized recommendation. Like, even showing someone the exact same post based on the people they follow arguably relies on information that's specific to that individual. So we have to think about what we're legislating here. We can't just do things to make ourselves feel better here. Like, what is the actual outcome of the language that's in the bills? And I think right now that's the big part that's actually missing. And we also have to keep in mind that just taking away Section 230 immunity does not make platforms automatically liable. Like it's just like this conversation online, as if we take it away and all of a sudden they're going to be liable for everything they do. Stuff still has to be proven. And after all, the companies have many legal avenues to fall back on outside of Section 230. So we need to be thinking about all of that when we see how lawmakers are targeting this section as the end all be all to the problems that we see online. Like, let's think about these things before we make a bigger mess than the one that we currently have.
Can I jump in next?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I think everything Danielle just said was so on point. We could like take that answer and pull at the threads and have a whole other conversation. So I'll try to be concise. Just like tech companies aren't all a monolith, algorithms aren't all a monolith. There are some algorithms that are like really important and helpful. And I always joke that without algorithms, the internet would kind of be like trying to read a phone book. It's just a lot. And people clearly prefer things that are relevant to them. And that's not just like on Facebook, that's across the internet. So we have startups that use algorithms to do personal recommendations. That's kind of their competitive advantage. They can look at an events calendar and say, based on what we know about you, we think these are the most relevant events. If they couldn't do that anymore, or if they lost 230, if they tried to do that, I'm not sure that they would continue to exist. The value in 230 isn't, to Danielle's point, that companies would otherwise be held liable. The value in 230, especially for startups who don't have a ton of money, is it's a procedural shortcut to go into court and say, we're not the ones who said this, we're just the platform. You don't mean to sue us, you mean to sue someone else. That's what asserting 230 at a motion to dismiss stage means. And if you change 230, even in ways that say you're liable for content you amplify, suddenly you're opening the door to a startup having to say, well, did we amplify it under the law? Did we amplify it in the way the law means? And now you're fighting this out in court. And suddenly a case that would cost maybe $30,000 to dismiss could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to get dismissed, even if you would ultimately win the case as a startup hosting content. And so any changes, especially around algorithmic amplification, I think kind of miss the fact that algorithms are all over the place and do lots of good things. And the value in 230 isn't that you would otherwise lose the lawsuit, because you still have the First Amendment, you still have contract law behind you, right? This isn't a guarantee. It's just an important way to prevent startups from having to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. So we can, like I said, pull on that forever, but I think that's a starting point for me.
Just
jump in.
Oh, sorry, David, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Kate.
I think, Logan, you asked the exact right question that we all have thoughts on, and I agree with everything that Danielle and Kate said. I think we also are kind of missing that content moderation efforts and processes and systems are more complex than just leave it up or take it down, right? Algorithms and algorithmic systems help with content moderation, right? Help reduce some of the content that maybe is close to the line of violating a guideline, community guideline or policy, but doesn't quite make it there. It helps platforms to raise up authoritative information in the case of like misinformation, right? To kind of balance out some of the information online. And so I think like when we think about algorithms, we're thinking about it in this one context, but I think it's important that we remember that they not only make the internet more useful, they also make the internet safer and higher quality for users. And so we need to think about those things as well.
And I would just jump in. +1, I think everything everybody said. I'm glad we started with Danielle as the lawyer on this panel. I am not a lawyer, but so what I can do is refer to some of the First Amendment lawyers who I know who've studied this issue in detail, who have raised the issue. And so Daphne Keller from Stanford, Jeff Kossoff, who wrote the book on Section 230, have written in the Washington Post, that the Supreme Court has been clear that laws restricting the distribution of unpopular speech can raise the same First Amendment problems as law that prohibits that speech outright. I think that's something that the political rhetoric around Section 230 has not really contended with. And we need to recognize that also a lot of the very real harms for a lot of communities online are in the United States. We're talking about constitutionally protected speech. So we need to think about other ways of getting at those harms. And that's one of the reasons why I think the kind of industry-driven process that we're working on and we're seeking feedback on from civil society, from academics, from users, offers another avenue that isn't going to run into some of those legal hurdles.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, David. And something that you see lawmakers in Congress still in the process of learning how to legislate around. I'm curious to get views of anyone of you guys. Are there ways that Congress can, seek to address some of the things they're concerned about by legislating around some of those other tools or other ways to address speech online without necessarily touching Section 230? Some of them, like the PACT Act, for example, are focused on transparency and disclosure to users and trying to empower them in that way. But do you see some ideas laying around that they can pick up that don't necessarily require amending Section 230?
I think that you hit on one, Logan, which is like thinking about transparency and thinking about what more we can do to encourage companies to be more transparent about their policies and their systems, potentially having mechanisms for notice when content is removed and appeals, thinking about what metrics should be disclosed over time to understand how these systems are working, thinking about some of the things that David is doing at the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership as far as assessments go. I think there is a lot in the details here that need to be worked out, and there are a lot of different types of services that we need to think about. Not everything works exactly the same online, and so there has to be flexibility and certainty here. I also think one area that Kate raised, and I agree, is federal privacy legislation. So when we're concerned about specific types of harms, federal privacy legislation would go a long way in helping there. And I think that is a discussion that is ongoing. A lot of people have said that we need that, and it would be worthwhile spending more time on the details of what that would look like.
Well, that points in another direction I was hoping to raise. So, Kate, you mentioned the importance of considering different types of services online. There's all sorts of different business models, companies that have some role in speech and content, but is not necessarily, playing the same role that Facebook is. So there's clearly a need to have some sort of recognition of that in how the law works. So obviously the US is not the only country that's been grappling with some of these issues. I know a lot of you are following closely what's going on in Europe with the DSA and that whole process. So they've been developing a very elaborated approach to dealing with content and liability online. And they're driving in the direction of this sort of tiered system, right? Where there are different types of services with different types of obligations. Do you think US policymakers have something to learn from the way Europe is going about addressing these issues? I know US policymakers are often not great about looking to other countries for inspiration, but curious if you think there's anything they should be picking up on over there.
I can start, unless that's to someone besides me. I think that recognizing the different roles in the ecosystem is really important. It's not, lots of companies that are involved in hosting speech don't host the speech directly, right? And so recognizing that there's kind of a whole stack and where do the obligations fall is a really important distinction. But I do think, the US has a really unique free speech foundational underlying everything, and a lot of speech that we don't like, that you and I don't like, that like Congress even they can agree they don't like, is constitutionally protected. And it seems crazy as someone who talks to startups that have to navigate this, to hold a startup or a company hosting content more liable than you hold the person creating the content under the law. If you're creating that setup, I think you're going to end up in a world where nobody wants to host risky content, and suddenly things like Me Too, the Me Too movement wouldn't exist if Twitter was held more liable than the people creating the Me Too content. So I think that's like an important thing to keep in mind. I often hear like, why can't the US do something like NetzDG? And that's because we don't have speech laws like that. So we also have the Fourth Amendment, and there are kind of protections around scanning and searching content when it's directed by the government that we can't do. So it's important to look to other countries and see what's working. And I think viewing Europe as kind of like a place to experiment around content is interesting and worth discussing. But I don't think there's any way to kind of port over what other countries are doing, because we have such a unique system here.
I would just add to that of course, it's not just Europe. Dozens and dozens of countries all around the world are considering and enacting content regulations of various kinds. Freedom House, in their latest report, I think said there were 48 countries in the last year pursuing new rules related to content online. So we're seeing this wave of content regulation. I think some of it is very well considered and well intended. Other is being actively used to suppress, political speech and human rights in different places around the world. And we need to be mindful of this wider context. So all kinds of like-minded democratic governments should be thinking about how to do this in a way that protects people's rights, protects the things that we value, the ability to organize online, the opportunities for innovation for startups, all of those good things, while trying to get at the harms. I think one thing definitely worth adopting from the European approach is something I think Danielle mentioned in her introductory comments, is to be thoughtful, considered, deliberate, and pursue an evidence-based approach. In Europe, the Digital Services Act, there's been years of study and preparation and revision and incorporation of that. There's still a lot of pros and cons to what's going on there, but I think we can maybe adopt that kind of a process to thinking about these things.
I'm sure no one could object to that. Yeah, so I'd like to maybe turn to a couple questions we've gotten from the audience, and I will remind folks again, if anything pops to mind, please put it in the Q&A, and we'd be happy to work it in. So there's one question that's come in around this question of sort of harmful content versus illegal content, I think, which is one of the problems that I think we would, well, many would identify in the way that some European countries have gone about doing this. So question is, does government have a role in identifying what is an online harm and to require platforms to remove harmful content, potentially with a specified deadline? And when, sorry, to remove harmful content when a certain threshold is triggered. So is it a productive approach or just too dangerous to try to define those types of categories?
Can I take a first crack at this? So I think this is, I personally am concerned about letting the government define what online harm is outside of contexts that are clearly legal. And I think a great example of this, Senator Klobuchar has a bill around health misinformation, right? Health misinformation in the last 18 months, we are like living in unprecedented times. The conversation over health misinformation is like this perfect microcosm of everything that's concerning about speech. If you think about, April of 2020, the push to get masks was considered health misinformation because we all thought we had to save the masks for medical professionals. And then 2 months later, right, it was like, you have to wear a mask, and any conversation about saving masks for health professionals, that was health misinformation. And then we all got vaccinated, and then it was, well, now vaccinated people don't need to wear masks indoors. And so pushing for masks was the wrong thing. And then it was like, no, wait, you do need to wear masks indoors. And that's not at all a criticism of the health infrastructure, right? This is changing and evolving, but it is a good example that what's considered health misinformation in good faith today is true tomorrow, and then it changes back so quickly. And if you tried to navigate conversations around whether or not to wear masks on the internet at various points of 2020, I mean, it would have been impossible for a company to get that right day to day. And so I really worry about kind of giving anyone, that's a best case example. That is smart people doing their best to do the right thing, still can't agree on the facts. And then you work in things like election misinformation or hate speech against hate groups. And suddenly I'm not even sure how you try to square that. And I think it opens a really scary Pandora's box that we, again, because of the First Amendment, have legal problems with, but just like philosophically, I think we should all be very careful there.
I would just add, oh, please.
I'm sorry. I would also add that it's also just very hard to describe certain harms. Like, how would have Facebook, if we look at the Capitol, the insurrection at the Capitol, like what one post could they have taken down to have made that better? Like it's so complicated. It's more than just taking down stuff or leaving things up. It can, and I agree with Kate that I'm very leery of letting the government define certain things like that because of the things that she just said. She absolutely is correct. 1 minute, one thing is this today, and then the next minute it's not. So I honestly don't have the answers. And I think that's why we have these type of discussions, but it's a very fine line to try and walk on regarding Section 230 and content moderation.
I would just build on that briefly. I think two things, drawing from some of the previous comments folks have made, is that if you are then putting companies in this position of deciding what is or is not, harmful with some sort of, legal, kind of liability in that place, they will err on the side of taking down more content. There are numerous empirical studies from all around the world documenting how this happens, and that if you then layer on top of the fact that they will use automated tools to take down more content, then the content that's going to be disproportionately affected by that is that of all sorts of communities, vulnerable communities, minority communities, all of the points that Danielle made earlier. So I think we want to avoid that sort of cascading series of consequences.
Yeah, we had another question that came in, which gets at something quite foundational for how people make money on the internet, which is ads. So what consequences do you see for how changes to Section 230 impact online advertising, good or bad? We already touched on this in the context of algorithms and targeted advertising. Clearly a sensitive issue for a lot of companies. Thoughts on impacts for advertising?
Well,
I think advertising, oh, sorry, Danielle, please.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think advertising is just kind of an extension of what we were just talking about speech, right? Advertising can have a really important role, right, for people accessing information, for businesses, kind of reaching their audiences. And I think when you think about the potential consequences of removing Section 230 for advertising, you have to think about how that would impact the ecosystem. Do advertising networks limit who can advertise and what they can specifically advertise about? What impacts would that actually have on people, like the large amount of people who use the internet to kind of reach their customers? And I think those are important considerations as we consider reforms in this space.
I completely agree. And as Black content creators and Black e-commerce businesses are starting to emerge, that's something that we think about at our nonprofit, just because of the fact that now that they're just starting to emerge into this new digital economy, starting to get their feet wet, what will it mean if Section 230 protections are taken from them? And what would it mean if certain online advertising things are taken away? Because this is how it's a cheaper version of getting or being able to reach their audiences. And this usually is the only way outside of word of mouth that they can reach their audiences. So I do think that these are great questions. It's just going to be a hard, solution. It's going to be a hard journey to a solution, I shall say.
All right, one additional question came in, which is pushing us on algorithmic amplification and how that relates to free speech questions. So question is, isn't there a certain level of confusion between free speech as the expression of an individual and the responsibility of amplification algorithms that are really important for the platforms? So is there a way, should there be more responsibility around amplification? Is it as simple a case as that's the free speech of the platforms, or is there some way we should think about getting at that?
I would just say, yes, there should be more responsibility and more thoughtful examination and consideration of the role of recommendation and ranking algorithms in, the sort of spread of viral content of different kinds and what sort of impacts that may have on user safety. But swapping in algorithmic amplification for content in legislation, it belies the complexity of these issues. And I think it's not the easy solution to this that some may think it is.
I also think there's been some, research and academic papers who kind of have come to the conclusion that this type of carve out would also lead to overblocking of content and generally make services less useful for consumers and for communities. So I think while I agree with David, we need to think carefully about how these systems are working and make sure that companies are acting responsibly. I also think we need to understand what the potential consequences will be for such a reform and how companies may react and what that means for speech online.
Well, in our final few minutes here, I just want to give you all one last chance to give a wrap up and hopefully plot a way forward here. So we've explored some complex aspects of this policy issue, touched on some of what Congress is up to these days. So I'd like to leave our audience, if we can, with a sense of what comes next. So maybe as a final word, could each of you just take a minute to lay out what you see as productive next steps for stakeholders and policymakers on Section 230? Maybe let's start with Danielle, perhaps.
Thank you, Logan. So all in all, Section 230 has many pros and cons. This is a very complex area of law, to say the least. And while a repeal of the law may not be the best route, it's obvious that something must be done. And in saying that, like I've said before, I urge policymakers to be careful, intentional, and considerate when legislating policy prescriptions for the issues that we see in Section 230, and making sure that they're actually defining things that make sense and not just legislating things to make us feel better, like things that actually have actual impacts in a good way. As well as I would say for the companies, I would say the companies need to seriously reimagine what their diversity and inclusion efforts look like. A lot of the issues that we see in these companies with regards to inaccuracies in the AI and content moderation is because there's not enough representation there to begin with. So if we can just think about this approach, not from just a technical aspect, but also from a human aspect of like, if there's not enough Black people in the room, probably the AI is not going to know how to recognize when I'm speaking about something that's not common knowledge. Like, we just need to be more, take a common sense approach, and also just think outside the box and think about bringing all diversity into all aspects of the company, from when you're writing the algorithms, when you're developing the algorithms, when you're training the data sets, when you're hiring a diverse workforce. All of that is going to play into how these platforms work. So I thank you guys, and I had a great discussion today.
Thanks, Danielle. Maybe Kate Sheridan next.
Thank you so much. And I think, you know, all of us have talked a lot about the potential downsides to Section 230 reform, but I think one thing that has come across between me and all of the other panelists here is that we all think that there is work to be done, right? To better understand the root challenges we face as a society and figure out what the solutions could be. And I think while there have been a lot of discussions around Section 230 reform, there needs to be more multi-stakeholder efforts that are truly multi-stakeholder, with more people at the table, services of different sizes, the public interest community, advocates, people who are academic experts, or legal experts, professors, because there are a lot of different stakeholders here. And so to think only about tech companies in this space, or even a few tech companies in this space, is limiting the potential solutions we have here to create a better internet more broadly. And I think we would all agree there is much more work that needs to be done to examine these issues and work together on those solutions.
Thanks, Kate. Let's go David and then Kate.
I would just add to those great closing remarks. Starting with an evidence-based approach, we should ensure that Congress is looking at the impacts of the previous reform to Section 230, SESTA-FOSTA Act, intended to address, legitimate concerns about sex trafficking, has wound up with unintended and really damaging consequences for marginalized communities, sex workers. And I think there's a need to study that and to learn the lessons of that before considering further legislative action. And to think about this broader set of tools. We've offered our approach, our assessment methodology, as a contribution to this conversation. We're seeking feedback on that. We've posed some specific questions. All of that is on our website, dtspartnership.org. And so welcome the input of a wide array of stakeholders to try to start the kind of multi-stakeholder conversation that Kate just alluded to. Thank you.
No pressure, I'll go last. Hopefully everything everyone else has said is of course correct. I think, referencing the earlier part of our conversation, anyone looking to change 230 needs to be really clear-eyed and concise about the harms they're trying to prevent, and they need to grapple with a few messy but very real realities. Content moderation is inherently imperfect, and I really do encourage anyone who thinks about these issues in kind of a legislative or academic sense to try to moderate content in any kind of even small community. And just our First Amendment, the legal framework here regarding speech is really complicated to get around, and be really careful that, we're thinking through the free speech implications, because anytime you think you're changing the opportunities for one kind of speech online, I promise you're changing the opportunities for many other kinds of speech, and that can have unintended consequences that falls disproportionately on already marginalized communities. And then building off of what Danielle said, I think, of course, the industry needs to be more aware of making sure their systems work equitably, but also decision makers in government should be super aware of that too. If you're hearing about a problem for the first time in this panel or in these kinds of conversations, I promise you smart people have already thought about this and grappled with it firsthand, and make sure that you're thinking about the consequences for them, not just people who look and think and work like you. So.
All right, well, thank you, Kate. And thank you to all of our panelists, Kate, David, and Danielle. I thank you for the great discussion. I hope we broke some new ground for some folks in the audience. And I'm sure we will all be discussing Section 230 even more in the future. So Congress has given no signs it's going to let up on that front quite yet. So I look forward to continuing these discussions into the future. Thank you so much.